Welcome to DECODED, providing in-depth insight into cybersecurity. Post-pandemic, we take stock on the mental impacts of working from home and in isolated environments. And now we're facing hybrid working. Can we take control? Is this the right time to take stock and address any issues we can identify to stay happier? Protective factors can keep us going, but when they disappear, we can experience problems. We address all of these issues and more with special guest Olly Church from the Eleos Partnership. Show notes, including any links mentioned in the show, are available at decodedcyber.com. Olly Church is the co-founder of the Eleos Partnership, an organisation that aims to help managers and other leaders within an organisation to set the conditions for their people to thrive from a mental health perspective. They focus on the gap between the ignorance that abounds in many people's perceptions of mental health issues and the expertise of the clinicians. Olly used to work in the military and has personal experience of addressing significant mental challenges. He and Mark sat down to talk about this and more. Over to Mark and Olly.
Well, we're going to be talking about the mental health and our observations in the cybersecurity industry, but really what we'll be talking about is relevant for a whole cross-section of industries where over the last couple of years, people have been forced into working at home or in an isolated environment. And now, as the world starts to open up again, are being reintroduced to commute, to working in the office, and perhaps hybrid working. And on a really basic level, you might think that, everyone will think, well, yeah, that's great. It's back to work as it was. It's great to see everyone and business as usual. But of course, that's perhaps not the case for a lot of people.
No, that's right. That's right. Absolutely. And I think that, some people had good experiences during the pandemic, lockdown, working from home. Some people had less good experiences. But I think the point is that they were all unique, weren't they? They were all individual, because our lives are made up of so many different factors. It's very hard to apply a sort of a blanket approach to how we do these things. And the reality is, I think that everything, every part of our life has been thrown up in the air, hasn't it? And the question is, do we just let it settle and see what happens? Or actually, do we try and place these things where we think we want them from both an individual and a professional perspective?
Well, you brought up something really interesting at the start when you introduced yourself, insofar as you spent all that time in the military and you were exposed to a number of traumatic events, which you just let roll at the time. It all sort of built up, I guess, cumulatively. To a point where it became too much. And it was hindsight that led you to look back at those events and realize that you probably could have handled them differently rather than just perhaps ignoring them at the time.
Yeah.
And I wonder now whether we're in the position where individuals are having experienced their unique individual time through the COVID pandemic and now opening up into the new way of living, whether this is the right time for people to grasp their own version of where they are in mental health terms and to take action or not. I mean, a lot of people were probably don't need to do anything.
So yes, some operational trauma had an impact. But actually, whilst I was in a supportive environment where I understood what my sense of identity was, what my sense of purpose was, who I was connecting with, good, strong bonds, actually that protected me. But when I left the army, my identity, my sense of connection, my sense of purpose basically disappeared. So those protective factors, weren't there, and I hadn't realized that I needed to replace them. And I think that's, what a lot of people will be experiencing is that, for some people, protective factors were very much in place, pre-pandemic, because they enjoyed coming into the office, socializing. They could connect with their friends after work. And actually that kept a wrap on many of the risk factors that they might have been carrying, because we all, have protective and risk factors in relation to our mental health, but we don't necessarily acknowledge them or deliberately address them. And so I think what we saw during the pandemic is that many protective factors were removed and many risk factors were introduced. And so we sort of had a bit of an imbalance, and that for many people resulted in a bit of a decline in their mental health, to a greater or a lesser extent. And so when we come back to, having a think about how we live our lives ultimately, I think it's really useful to have a deliberate focus on, okay, how do I build in protective factors? Is that for me actually working from home? Because I'm quite introverted and I find the office environment quite overpowering. Or actually, am I a bit more extroverted and I find that I need that connection with other humans? Or actually, is it somewhere in the middle? And I think having the ability, as a manager, as a leader, to have those conversations openly and understand how we can balance the needs of the organization with, the needs or the preferences of the individual, I think is really important. This comes back to this idea, a blanket approach is never really going to work. And we've seen that already, with the civil service. I think, there's been great uproar against the diktats that are coming from various ministers. And I think people will vote from their feet. We've been introduced to this concept that we can do things differently. So, within reason, with negotiation and some sort of give and take on both sides, I think we can get to a point. But this stuff doesn't happen automatically. It does take time. It takes a bit of effort. It takes some frank conversations. But I think, as a society, we probably end up in a better place than probably where we were.
If we take that that strategic aim all the way back down to our office environment, you've talked there about having the protective cloak around an individual, and we can talk about that in a little while about what a business might be able to do. But as an individual, and I'm listening to this, I'm going, okay, right, well, Olly says it's good that if I can identify what can I do to protect myself against the risk factors that are associated with me. But do I need to see a professional to identify what those protected factors are? What's the process? What am I meant to be thinking about to actually work out what I can do individually?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. You bring up the professional thing. So a lot of this is preventative, and I think if I had known what I know now previous to my instance of poor mental health, I actually would have avoided a lot of it. And for me, a lot of this comes down to the basic fact that as humans, we've evolved to have a number of emotional needs. So something really interesting called human givens theory, which basically states that we have, 9 or so emotional needs. And if they're not being fulfilled, potentially our mental health is at risk. So the need for connection with other people, the need for a sense of sort of competence and achievement. And for a lot of people, that will have been impacted by having to work from home and homeschool and amongst kids, all these sorts of things. So I think, if we are currently in a good place from a mental health perspective, I think we can do a number of these things ourselves. And again, that was one of the realizations for me, was that actually, in many cases, I am the only person that can do this. Having that, that willingness to take responsibility for our mental health is a hugely important first step. But I think, if you want to go and speak to, a coach, an emotional counselor, I think that can all be really helpful. There's this danger that we only ever take action when things have got really bad, isn't there? And actually, a bit like maybe sort of couples therapy, there are great opportunities to do this stuff earlier. And I think actually, many younger people are grasping this fact that therapy can be a really good preventative action. And it doesn't have to be, responsive or reactive. And it's really just about understanding ourselves better, understanding how we work, understanding other people. So, how we communicate, how we manage the conflict that may arise between us. So all sorts of different things. But I think, we've only got a relatively short amount of time here, Mark, and mental health is a hugely complex subject, and I wouldn't profess to understand it completely myself. But if we can encourage people to do anything from this session, is to sort of pique that curiosity to think, okay, maybe there is more that I can do, and maybe investigate other training or sort of self-development opportunities. Because self-help, it gets a bit of a bad reputation, but from my perspective, my experience, it is absolutely vital to protect ourselves from the possibility of mental illness.
And if people are thinking, well, I want to do something, I want to promote the positive aspects of my mental health and my protection against the negativity, but I don't want to spend money.
Yeah.
And also I'm worried about the stigma or the peer pressure that comes with getting therapy, because I think in this country we're probably not quite there as a society in terms of its wider acceptance, and so an individual might be feeling restricted in their ability to reach out. If I wanted to do something just for myself, is it a case of just doing more of what I enjoy doing, or is that a dangerous route? Because I might really enjoy going out for a drink, which obviously to a point that might help, but then you take it too far or too often, then you're just creating a larger problem. Could it be as simple as just, what do I enjoy? Do more of it, or should I research a little bit more and do and understand the sort of self-help techniques that are out there?
Yeah, I think there's to go back a step, Mark. I think you're right about societal perspectives and societal sort of potentially stigma. Is that we tend, when we hear the word mental health, to sort of think of it as a threat, don't we? Whereas actually, I think it's a massive opportunity to start to understand ourselves better. And it's, you talk about doing what you enjoy, so, going out for a drink in many ways can be really helpful if we have one or two, because it may encourage us to talk to our friends where we wouldn't otherwise. But we know that alcohol is a depressant. We know that it is a risk factor in developing poor mental health. So again, it's about balance. And that's a really boring answer, but I think it absolutely is. But also understanding, again, how we've evolved, understanding that regular exercise is our body's natural way of removing stress, hormones and chemicals from our system, that sleep is absolutely vital, that actually just the ability to talk to somebody, whether it's somebody that we're very close to, or actually maybe even a complete stranger, about what's going on in our heads, is a great way of unleashing a lot of these thoughts from our subconscious mind, where we might think about them irrationally and emotionally and ruminate. Whereas actually by talking to somebody or simply writing something down, we can process it more rationally, more logically, and actually it can remove some of the stress around it. We start to see where there are opportunities to take action. And to sort of to go back to your point, what can we do? I think, there's a lot of good free mental health training out there, which, is not particularly, overwhelming or difficult, but it's just about understanding the basics. So understanding how to balance risk factors and protective factors, understanding how we can make sure that our emotional needs are met. Because, sometimes we're quite good at developing these things instinctively. And I think I was originally, but I had got to a point where my natural levels of resilience ran out. Our ability to be resilient is shaped by all sorts of different things. So, our upbringing and the experiences that we might have had as children, what's happened to us, our religion, our culture, our values, our sexual identity, our gender, our age, all of these things will shape our ability to be resilient. And again, the risk factors may be discrimination, they may be any kind of exclusion, because all of this is having an impact on how we think, feel, and behave, which is ultimately how we can consider our mental health. And I go back to these emotional needs that we have, and the role that our subconscious mind plays. Our subconscious mind is always trying to protect us So actually that's the thing that's telling me, oh, actually I don't want to go out for a run today because I need to conserve my energy. That's how we've evolved. But our conscious mind is saying to us, well, actually I know that it's going to be good for me. I know it's going to be a bit uncomfortable to start with, but longer term I'll reap the rewards. So we can have these really conflicted internal conversations with ourselves. And for me, actually, meditation has been really helpful in just to improve that conversation within myself, so that I'm pursuing slightly healthier habits on a regular basis. I'm pursuing the ability to bring in protective factors and try and banish some of those risk factors. But there's plenty of information out there. I think we just need to have this willingness to engage with it, whether that's in a work setting or whether it's actually just starting to engage in some free resources which are out there.
You talk about the work setting, and one of the points you brought up there was talking and how important talking is as a way of not only identifying in yourself what the risk factors are bubbling up, but also the protective factors you might become more aware of them, but also the perspective on things. Often when you overthink things in your mind, they may become more you might as an individual put more priority on them than perhaps they require in terms of a wider context. You might need a third person just to tell you that you're worrying about things unnecessarily because of X and Z. But in a work environment where we are here, there's a managerial hierarchy, and if I've got a new starter, they're in the company, they've been in the company for a couple of weeks, are they going to feel confident going into their line manager who writes their quarterly report or their annual review about their ability to perform, and are they going to feel confident in talking to them about these personal mental health issues? Now, I know we should try and create that environment, but there is always that mismatch in terms of hierarchy in a conversation. In a company, is there any benefit of training people at all levels of management to be able to talk and discuss and understand the signs of mental health degradation, in order that you can speak to a peer about these kind of things without any worry that it's going to come back in your records or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to your first point, are they going to feel comfortable talking to their new manager? In short, probably not. Okay, we're all wanting to maintain a sense of professionalism. We're all concerned about, giving off the wrong impression. We can't cope, whatever it is. We don't know stuff. So it comes to this point of what's termed psychological safety, which many people will have heard of. If you haven't come across it, you've certainly experienced it. There's this feeling where we do feel comfortable to share concerns, where we are comfortable being ourselves, that we feel that we have this ability to talk to people about any challenges, not just our mental health. But I think you're right. Ultimately, where there is good psychological safety in teams, largely led by, the management, creating that environment where people do feel comfortable, it tends to encourage peer support. And so actually, people feel more comfortable talking to each other. And so over the last few years, there's been a significant rise in the instances of training mental health first aiders, which I think is a great it's a great resource to have within an organization. And I train people myself, and I think it is a really good capability. But there's this danger that what we do is we silo that knowledge and those skills within a few people around the organization. They might even be in HR. And frankly, who wants to go and talk to HR about our mental health? It could be senior leaders, and who feels comfortable in that. So I think it's two points from that. If we are going to train things like mental health first aiders, they need to be representative across the organization, so people can connect with somebody that either they know or maybe they don't know, but they sort of have a connection with. They would feel comfortable talking to them. But I think actually to go beyond that is more important. I think that actually it's really valuable to give as many people in an organization, I mean, ideally everybody, even just a basic bit of knowledge on, as you say, noticing signs of poor mental health in themselves or others, but also actually understanding how we can proactively protect our mental health. And I think I mentioned earlier that, resilience really is a team sport, particularly in a professional setting. I may feel resilient, but actually, if the wider team is not encouraging, a relatively open dialogue, and we aren't able to support each other, then I think that's always going to have its limitations. I'm not saying that we have to spend our days, having sort of group therapy sessions. That's not it at all. It's just about everybody feeling comfortable, everybody knowing what is expected from them, feeling that they can, challenge in a constructive way, because that allows us all to, get a little bit closer to meeting all those emotional needs. So yeah, I think there's definitely a few options there.
That's quite a good action point then, potentially. You talked about mental health first aid training, and I wonder how widely understood that type of training is in the sector. I mean, we know about it, but it's something that has only really come across our understanding in the last few years. For us, it was have a first aider, but they're all cuts and bruises.
Yeah.
And it was never really something that we understood, that you could train someone relatively quickly in mental health first aid. And you're trying to achieve, without going through the training, but you're trying to achieve the same aim. It's a sort of identify what the problem is, and then on a very basic level, and then steer that person towards the right help in order that they get the treatment they need, in the same way that you would if you had a cut and needed to go to an A&E department, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's about exploring this middle ground between ignorance, which, let's face it, a lot of society is still at, and I was at until, relatively recently, and expertise of counsellors, of, therapists, psychiatrists, and an understanding that actually, with the right intention, with some of the right basic knowledge, we are almost always going to have a positive impact in relation to people and their mental health. And actually understanding that, inaction, not doing anything, is almost always the worst, course of action. And that was my experience. I didn't have the language and the knowledge to be able to articulate that I was starting to experience poor mental health, and neither did anybody around me. And even if they picked up on it, my boss, my colleagues didn't feel comfortable coming to me and saying, Olly, I've noticed, a few things. Do you think you could benefit from some support? And I may or may not have responded. I don't know, because, resistance and sort of denial is quite common. But actually, I think, my outcome could have been quite different. It could have been a couple of weeks off work, slowly, coming back with some support, as opposed to actually what happened is that I convinced myself that I had to resign because I would never, continue my career, never get promoted with a diagnosis like this. And that actually led to, a couple of years of sort of actually worsening mental health, and, quite a lot of unemployment. And, I think actually, it's useful to understand that, a significant amount of mental illness within society is what we might call avoidable. Has its roots in more social causes, like how we live our lives, how we treat ourselves, how we treat each other. Clearly there are instances of mental illness which have a very physiological and medical background. So thinking about things like psychosis and bipolar, but actually a lot of this is about, reactions to those emotional needs not being met, the risk factors outweighing the protective factors. So, the more knowledge we have, actually at the lower levels, we can start to shape things more proactively. And this is not about, people overstepping the mark. This is not about, a mental health first aider stepping up and saying, right, I've diagnosed you with depression. You need to do X, Y, and Z. This is about getting them, as you would do as a physical first aider, to that appropriate professional help in a timely manner, so that you can prevent things getting worse. And that's really where the parity lies.
We've up till now we've spoken quite a lot about the individual, but I work in a cybersecurity company, and as a manager, we're talking generically. We're not talking about the company I'm working at the moment. But if we're in a position where we have not got strong mental health awareness, we haven't got the training, and it's never really a spoken subject up till now. And I'm a manager, and I'm getting pressure, external pressure, to try and introduce this training and this awareness. Have you experienced in the work that you've been doing any resistance from managerial level staff? Because there's a time commitment, there's a financial commitment, and you're opening up a box which has never been opened before. And it's kind of like, well, what good is going to come from this? Is it just going to be a raft of challenges that I'm going to have to then deal with as a company? Whereas what I'd much prefer to do is just to carry on the way that we've been working, and just delivering what the purpose of the company is, rather than dealing with these issues. Is that something that you've come across, or are you finding that people are coming to you are already forward leaning?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of things to consider here, Mark. First of all, most organizations, well, throughout history, have been dealing with the impacts of poor mental health. They just haven't known about it. So a lot of people going off with stress, as it was always euphemistically coined, that's mental illness, isn't it? A lot of people going off with seemingly physical health conditions, often masking mental health conditions. Low productivity has often been caused by poor mental health. So they've been dealing with it, but they just haven't confronted it. And so, I think, I do get people come to me who are keen and optimistic and who want to lead in this realm. But again, if they're relatively senior, they will have, middle managers who frankly are absolutely critical to getting this to work. If they're not going to block it, we see them broadly broken down into thirds. A third of them will be equally enthusiastic and see the benefits of doing this. We see, another third who are a bit agnostic. They're not quite sure. It all seems a bit difficult. And then a third who are actively resistant, the sort of things that you were mentioning. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because a lot of the resistance comes from fear. It comes from, this is all really, really quite scary to me. But instead of actually admitting that and building my knowledge and approaching it with, in a degree of enthusiasm, or at least cooperation, I'm just going to resist it. I get to deny it and hope it all goes away. But it really does. Where we see people actively engaging it, there will be, cans of worms opened, all those sorts of things. But actually, again, if we plan this properly, if we resource it properly, there's really only benefits to be had, because what we will find is that psychological safety improves, that people are actually far more likely to achieve what we might call an early intervention. So we hit things off at the pass. There's this fear that people will use the mental health card, just to get out of stuff. A lot of the evidence suggests that is really quite uncommon, and that actually people value the opportunity to explore these things in a slightly more open way. And I think there is increasing demand from the younger generation coming into the workforce. That makes me sound really old, doesn't it? But, there is an expectation that their mental health will be considered and taken seriously. And I think that's not unreasonable, is it? But again, it always has to be balanced with the needs of the individual and the needs of the organization. And that's where I think just these open conversations can be really helpful.
When it comes down to business and measuring effectiveness, there's quite often a high demand within very structured organizations to be able to demonstrate worth, and therefore I'm spending X amount of pounds or X amount of dollars. We're investing this amount of time in this product or this training. What are the direct outcomes of that, and how do you quantify it? Now, I can quantify a lot of physical things very easily. It's just simply counting them. But is there a simple way, or is it a lot more complex to really quantify the value that you are bringing into an organization when you invest in mental health?
Yeah, in one word, it is complex. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you're right. Organizations love to measure, don't they? And it's completely understandable. There's been quite a lot of research by the big consultancies. So I'm thinking sort of Deloitte and PwC, who will put out figures like for every £1 that an organization spends on mental health training, there is an ROI of £5. And I think they clearly have done some detailed research on that, and I think those they have a degree of rigor, those figures. But it can be much harder to actually measure it within an organization, because it's really difficult sometimes to measure a negative, isn't it? Something not happening. How do you know what you prevented? I think, whether organizations want to try and extrapolate it against things like absences, I think a lot of this is just far more subtle, isn't it? It's about actually people feeling comfortable. Do you attribute a rise in productivity or performance to the fact that people actually don't feel like they've got one arm tied behind their backs anymore? A lot of organizations will want to measure it using some kind of mental health app. I think that's great, but what we tend to see is that those apps get really low engagement levels. If you're lucky, 20% of an organization will download the app, and of them, 20% are probably going to use it regularly. I think that they're great. I think, got a lot of potential, but typically they aren't exposed to sort of mass take up. So your results are not always going to be that helpful or that accurate. And so it's a really wishy-washy answer, but actually, how about this is just the right thing to do? How about...
Yes, Olly, I was going to say there is a point where your managerial style turns into, I guess, more leadership. You go, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We need to invest in our staff, and investing in them should return us loyalty. It should return a willingness to deliver and be efficient and effective at their jobs.
Yeah.
Because that's what humans react to. You invest, and people want to. Most people want to pay back. So, but that's not an easy sell to a shareholder, I guess, when it's just the bottom line that they're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. There's all sorts of challenges to be faced, but how do you measure culture? And I sort of have very much come to the conclusion that understanding the mental health and well-being of our team is one of the key functions of leadership. Something that, I certainly in the past, whenever mental health was mentioned, I was like, right, this is nothing to do with me. Let's go and speak to the doctor or the welfare officer or the padre. This is somebody else's business, without realizing that actually I had a huge impact on the mental health of the people who were working for me as the primary influence on them. But also I had a lot of things that I could have in my control, or at least sphere of influence, that could benefit things. And I think, that's how we see shifts in culture, isn't it? Where people do things which are difficult, which are a bit scary. We engage in things that actually help people to feel more comfortable. And, it really strong links between mental health and diversity and inclusion. If you've got people feeling comfortable to be themselves, you are going to recruit and retain a more diverse workforce, which we know is almost always beneficial for almost every element of an organization. And so people feel that psychological safety of inclusion because, they know that their mental health is taken seriously, and people understand the connections between discrimination and poor mental health, for example. And leaders can set the example.
So, based on everything we've spoken about, if I was to find out more, either as an individual or as a manager in an organization, is there anywhere that you could suggest I might want to start looking, to point me in the right direction as a beginner in this field?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think, if I'm a line manager, one of a really good free resource that I would recommend is the Mental Health First Aid England line managers resource. It gives really good, clinically validated best practice guidance on actually how do I shape things. From my perspective as a line manager, what can I do? How do I bring the policies and practices, the processes of the organization to life in relation to mental health if any of my team members are experiencing a decline in it? I think, there's a lot of good charities out there with some good basic stuff. So Mind have a number of, really good resources.
Olly, I'll just ask you a question on that. The Mental Health First Aid England, if I am listening to this podcast in the States, for example, am I still able to access that material, and is it still relevant to me outside of England?
Yeah, so it's MHFA England is specific to England, but in the US there is Mental Health First Aid USA, so a comparative organisation who will work with organisations to achieve similar ends. So yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of sister organisation, if you like, over in the US. Absolutely. But a lot of this comes down to the fact that yes, there's some self-help out there, but just like any capability or culture change in an organization, if it's going to be anything more than a very, very brief tick box exercise, if it's going to become any kind of transformative process, we need to put some resourcing behind it. And so, there's a number of organizations, us included, who will sit down and talk to businesses about actually how do they approach this. And, this probably sounds like a really thinly veiled sales pitch, but, we realize that actually this is a team-led sport. This has got to be done, with people, by their managers, rather than to them by, let's say, the HR department. If things are ultimately going to change, it's got to be organic, hasn't it? It's not something that we can do to people. It's got to be something that we give them the confidence, the structure, the resources to explore themselves. And little and often, I think, is far better than sending somebody away off for a 2-day course, because we all know what happens, don't we? We do a 2-day course, we get a folder, and it's really interesting at the time, but the folder goes in a drawer, and we never touch it again. So having the ability to build this into the flow of work is really important, I think. And that's how culture changes. That's how we get beyond just simple knowledge transfer to setting the culture that enables us to apply that knowledge.
Yeah, change happens over time. And this is change that people want to deliver at each level of the organization. You're right, I agree. This isn't something that can be dictated either from above or below as a polar entity, because unless everyone takes it up, you aren't going to shift that culture in the way that you want to shift it. There's just going to be a bit of conflict and a bit of dissatisfaction that things aren't happening. There's some good training resources there that you've recommended, and I'm pleased to hear that the Mental Health First MFA, what was it, MHFA England or USA, same organisation?
Yeah, they're really good start points.
And as an individual, where should I go? Is it just a question of Googling sort of charities, or
there's a lot of stuff out there, and as you'd imagine, it's sort of varying quality. But I think again, somewhere like Mind is a really good place to start. It's got some really good resources, and really, this I think should be, as I said, it's about piquing curiosity, understanding that we can influence mental health within organizations, within wider society. We can't leave it to therapists, psychiatrists, the mental health system, because otherwise they become overloaded, don't they? And that was really the point about mental health first aid starting as a concept. It's this realization that we didn't necessarily need more psychiatrists. Maybe we do because, frankly, they're overwhelmed. But actually, with a little bit of knowledge, across society, then actually we're far more likely to be in that preventative space, which we know is achievable and important. But as I said, it takes that knowledge and that confidence to be able to do it. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's got to be something that, as an organization, we build into, a long-term plan, I think.
It was really useful. I really appreciate your time today, Olly. It's been really interesting to hear both the mental health challenges that you've had and been able to successfully overcome. And I guess it's just a continual process for everyone. You've just got a very dramatic example about how it's affected the last few years of your life. And I guess everyone's experienced something at some sort of level over the last couple of years. And it's knowing what to do to encourage the good and mitigate those risks which chip away at your mental health. And the three things that you mentioned during the chat, which I think everyone can target without really investing a huge amount of energy on research or training or learning, is get sleep, do exercise, and talk to people. Whoever it is, it doesn't matter who you're talking to, I guess, as long as you're talking to someone about these things, to get life into a little bit of perspective for yourself.
Yeah, and it sounds really basic, doesn't it? But I think it's just, again, it's about understanding how our bodies and minds work and that they do respond to those things. And, they can be really good preventative measures, of that sort of releasing any stress that has built up, making sure that our brains are functioning as well as they can. And as you say, talking to people to externalize those fears that we have, because quite often, either that individual may be able to help us take action against them, or we realize that actually we were succumbing to what we might call the negativity bias, this tendency that we have as humans to see the worst, because it's helped us to stay safe. It's helped us to evolve and pick up on threats and dangers. But it's not necessarily that helpful for life in the 21st century.
And now, just before we finish, it's security life hack time. At the end of each episode, we give a special security tip that works for real people in the real world, for work and in personal lives. This episode's life hacker is Buon hacker Luis Corrons, who knows a thing or two about what can go wrong if you don't lock your computer when you leave it alone with colleagues or with your kids.
Always lock your computer where you're not using it. I have an anecdote. There is a company, a security company in Spain, which later on turned out to have a spin-off, which is now known as VirusTotal. I guess that many people will have heard about VirusTotal. So, they learn how to lock your computer every time you're not using it by force, let's say. Every time someone was leaving their computer unprotected, even for like 10 seconds, like to grab a glass of water, someone in the company was getting to that computer and messing with it right away, like changing the background, creating some patch file and putting there. Always. And so every time you visit them, you went to their company, every computer was locked down whenever the people was getting out. And it can be a real security problem. If you think it doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter. Even if you're at home and maybe the security risk might be your kid. for me, it's kind of like it's a memory muscle, really, right? Like when I'm using Windows, like click on the Windows button and then L from lock, and that's it, and you got it locked. I mean, it's so easy. Okay, if you're not used to it, maybe you need, I don't know, 5 minutes to get used to it, but you can do it with one hand, using just a couple of fingers. One click, and then you're locked.
Please subscribe, and if you enjoyed this episode, please send a link to just one of your close colleagues. We also have a free email newsletter. Sign up on our website, where you'll also find this episode's show notes and bonus episodes featuring full-length interviews with our guests. Just visit decodedcyber.com. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.